In 2019, independent filmmaker Gordy Price was served a subpoena for filming parts of his horror movie Crawford Road in Colonial National Historical Park without a permit. Price was summoned to appear in federal court and risk possible fines, jail time, or both. What began as a simple disagreement over permits escalated into a landmark First Amendment case.
I'm Bob Corn-Revere. I'm Chief Counsel of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I've been practicing First Amendment law for over 40 years, for most of that time in private practice, and then joined FIRE about 2 years ago. FIRE is an organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to defending First Amendment rights, whether in-house or in my capacity as a private lawyer. One way or the other, for the past 4 decades, I've been defending First Amendment rights.
I'm Colin McDonald. I'm an attorney at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. What I do at FIRE is represent people in court whose First Amendment right to freedom of speech and expression has been violated. We at FIRE represent all different kinds of people across the country with different beliefs. Our motto here at FIRE is, if the First Amendment protects it, we'll defend it.
I first learned about the charges that Gordy Price was facing from a fellow lawyer. There are a number of legal listservs among lawyers who do First Amendment work, and someone had said that there's this guy down in Virginia Beach who is actually facing charges for having filmed in a national park, which struck me as being bizarre. And so I also learned from that person that Gordy didn't have a lawyer, and that that was going to be a problem. So I reached out and volunteered to take the case.
I'm Gordy Price, and I'm the culprit in Price versus Barr, and I'm here with Bob Corn-Revere. And I keep forgetting.
Colin McDonald.
And Colin McDonald.
I'm James Persson.
So let's have James explain what was our thought processes, before we were shooting Crawford Road and why we didn't get permits.
I plead the fifth. I have no idea what Gordy's. No, shooting Crawford Road was sort of a passion. We saw the landmark. We wanted to use it in the film. We thought, hey, it's just us guys with a small camera. What harm can we do? We didn't have any big ambitions for the film or anything. And so we just basically went out with about 3 people, and we did what filmmakers do. We make movies, We did not think we were causing any harm or breaking any laws per se. We thought that, permits and that type of thing were for big Hollywood productions, not for us grabbing a DSLR and going out and filming, So,
Plus, we were too cheap.
Yeah. Oh,
It's $250
when
for
you're
a permit.
low budget, no budget. You're really we're investing our money in equipment and that type of thing. So every dollar, every dime makes a difference.
Well, and the fact is too that they wouldn't tell you how long it would take, or if they even accept you. So you're going to give them $250 just non-refundable.
Yeah, and there was a lot of hurdles, and again, it was more of a you put the permit in, you wait, and then you couldn't really coordinate. And people that make films with us, they have jobs, so certain days they're available, certain days they're not, and there's no guarantee. So there's a lot of hurdles that we had to encounter just to make it happen, and the permit process just wasn't friendly to that type of.
Well, that's a constant complaint that we've seen from people who've had to confront these rules, that every park handles it differently. They string people along, they don't answer questions, and as a consequence, it's really hard, even after you put the application in, to pay your fee, to know whether or not or when you'll get an answer or a permit.
Yeah, well, and this one, like, nature blogger I was watching, because that kind of blew up after the court case. But anyway, she goes to national parks and films each one, but the way it was set up was, if I'm going to Yosemite and then I'm going to Yellowstone, it's a different permit fee for every park. So to be a traveler and visit all the parks and do a YouTube blog, you'd have to spend thousands of dollars and wait for permits.
Gordy's case actually proceeded in two different phases. As I say, when I first got involved, I'd heard that he was facing charges, and so when I got involved, the first order of business was to try and get those charges dismissed. At the time, I think Gordy was fortunate to have a magistrate who refused to accept his plea, and that led to, when we got involved, to filing a motion to dismiss the charges on First Amendment grounds. The case involved a federal law that had been passed in 2000 that required, for any commercial filming on federal lands, for the filmmaker to get a permit from the National Park Service and to pay a fee. And if those conditions weren't met, then you could face charges under federal law. That's the situation that we were in when Gordy was charged with violating this law. And so we went to the court, filed a motion to dismiss, at which point the government really couldn't get out of the case fast enough. They decided that they would dismiss the charges on their own, and we said, not so fast. You were willing enough to charge this man with violating a law, make him come into court and defend himself. We should get a ruling from the court on whether or not this requirement is constitutional. The court ultimately accepted the government's offer to dismiss the charges, but then said that if Mr. Price has a remedy, that remedy would be in his bringing a case in federal court to have the law declared unconstitutional.
Okay, so we finished Crawford Road, and, well, the WTK article.
Well, yeah,
That
you know,
was
we
kind of the
got some local
catalyst.
press. WTKR came out and did an expose on Crawford Road, and now they wanted to use our film as a basis for this story, because we focused on a lot of the folklore.
And they
from that
used some
area.
footage from it, too.
Yes, and so that hit, so we getting this news coverage.
And our premiere.
And the premiere,
blew up.
and and I think what, at the end of the day, Gordy was accessible. He had a music store in York County. They knew who he was. This film was getting all of this press, and I guess the area of York County and Crawford Road and the things that happened. Let that be just what it is. It happened. Let's put it in ancient history, and what we're doing is kind of stirring up that folklore.
Yeah, it stirred up the TV.
Yeah,
article,
so I think they found us. There was a technicality that they could latch on to.
Well, and when we were doing WTKR, they came out to the bridge.
Yes,
you got WTKR out there, which it's fine.
That's right. Yeah.
They can film because they're news.
Yeah.
But anyway, so she actually took my information, and we were on top of Crybaby Bridge.
Yes.
Which was violating
we were just
the curfew.
It's curfew. We were just on the state park.
So she could have actually gone after WTKR at that time too. But anyway, she let us all go and let us keep filming. Mm-hmm. But we had to go back down to the bottom of Crybaby Bridge, mm-hmm. which was Yorktown, Yorktown property, not MPS. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so we get all this press, and I'm sitting at my store, and they come in, and they have pictures of the movie, and they must have got a copy somehow because they had all these big photos, and they got me like there's a 3-foot easement on Crybaby Bridge, and they got me in the movie walking up it. That was one of the things, and then walking on Crybaby Bridge, walking by the cannons, by the French Cross. They had all these photographs and gave it to me, and Mr. Price, we're going to serve you. And the same girl, and I guess her boss, served me at my store. And at the time, I was like freaking out. And we had a bite on it from a distributor.
Yes.
And I told her about it, and as soon as I told her about, well, let's wait for after the lawsuit, which now 7 years later, it's released on Fawcett.
And she still won't touch it. So at this point, but we found distributors that will, that are interested in putting the film out there. But that's 7 years that film sat on the shelf. And
yeah. So anyway, so I end up going to court, and thank God the judge. And they have a thing before court where I sign a piece of paper saying if I'm guilty or not guilty, and that really didn't make sense to me, and it freaked me out, and I didn't sign it because I was like, I'd never seen that before. You got to tell us if you're guilty or not guilty now before I even see a judge. So I didn't sign it, and there was probably 15 MPS officers, and it must have been their day of court. And apparently they make a pretty good living off of fining people because there was probably $1,500 in fines by 3 or 4 people before I even got up there. Anyway, so I get up there, and Mr. Price, how do you plead? And I said, man, I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess, and I'm talking to the judge, I guess I should plead guilty because I did shoot there. And he, but I don't know, it's weird. Anyway, so the judge, God bless him, Mr. Price, you're granted one continuance. I think you need to seek legal counsel, and we'll go ahead and set a continuance. And in my mind, I think this judge, which I won't mention his name, but I think he smelt some kind of First Amendment thing going on. So anyway, 3 weeks ago, a few days later, I contact Virginia Film Commission. And I say, is there an entertainment lawyer I can talk to? And God bless her. Week later, Paige Gold calls me and says, I'll look around, I'll put the word out, we'll see what we can do about getting you some consultation. So 3 weeks, a month go by, I forget, the court date's coming up, I'm starting to go, I guess I'm just going to go in there and plead guilty. And excuse me. Then all of a sudden I get a call from Paige, there's this lawyer who wants to talk to you. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I'll get some good advice. And so you sent me some questions, I think, on email, and then you sent one that was from you because you never told me the lawyer's name. And then, but one of the emails came from you, and I look, okay, who's this guy, Bob Corn-Revere? And I look you up, and I go, oh, man. He's done some big cases. He did the Super Bowl case and Playboy case and Supreme Court. And I'm like, geez, I'm going to get some good advice.
Well, we can we can sort of do the greatest hits. I argued a case in the Supreme Court for Playboy Entertainment Group in a challenge to a section of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It was a regulation of cable channels that had adult material and required that they control something called, quote, signal bleed, and that is if they're scrambled channels, if any of the adult material was visible or audible, then they had to turn off their channel for 2/3 of the broadcast day if they couldn't completely make sure that no one would ever experience signal bleed. And so we challenged that portion of the law on First Amendment grounds, and eventually went to the Supreme Court and won that decision on a 5-4 vote. Another case involved defending the CBS television network when it was charged with violating the FCC's broadcast indecency rules for the 2004 Super Bowl, which you might remember with the infamous wardrobe malfunction with Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake in the halftime show. There was the end of the show, end of their number where he reached across Janet Jackson's outfit and pulled off the outer portion, revealing her breast for 9/16 of a second. And so at the time it was alleged by the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates broadcasting, that that was done on purpose, on purpose by CBS. And so they charged or started an investigation to charge CBS with violating its broadcast indecency rules. And it was my job, after I was engaged by the network, to both find out what had happened and then ultimately make the case to the FCC that no, the network had not known that that was going to happen, that that was something the performers cooked up on their own, and that they shouldn't be held liable for that. The Federal Communications Commission was not convinced. They fined the network $550,000 for this event that lasted 9/16 of a second. And we spent 8 years in court, going up and down between the Court of Appeals and up to the Supreme Court and then back to the Court of Appeals to ultimately have a ruling from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals that the FCC was wrong and they had to pay CBS back that fine. And then another matter that wasn't a case exactly, but it was a matter that I got involved with, and that was an effort to seek a posthumous pardon for the comedian Lenny Bruce, who had been convicted in 1964 of violating New York State obscenity laws for his routines that he would give at adults-only late-night clubs in New York. Law had not really advanced that much at the time, and so the idea of a comedian being charged with word crimes, well, it seems absurd today. In the mid-1960s was still something that could happen. And so Lenny was convicted and ultimately died in California before he had a chance to perfect his appeal. And so I was asked by a friend who'd written a book about the trials of Lenny Bruce to see if we could do something about that. So we petitioned then Governor Pataki of New York and received the first posthumous pardon in New York State history for the comedian Lenny Bruce.
All right, let's get through the rest.
So for that Friday came, it was set up for Paige, me, and you Friday. And you asked me a few questions, and I'm like, cool, I got, and then you said, Mr. Price, would you like us to take your case pro bono? And I was like, are you
Where's
SH explanation point TING. Anyway, so what happened on your end and what made you decide to, deal with this nobody filmmaker?
Well, first of all, don't describe yourself as a nobody filmmaker. You're a guy who was exercising his First Amendment rights, who found himself crosswise with the government. And so that always makes it a serious matter. You're talking about your fundamental rights. I first became aware of this whole issue a few years before that, when the Justice Department, not the Justice Department, the Interior Department, was conducting a rulemaking on these filming rules. I had not heard of them before that, but I was then in private practice and I was representing public broadcasters who were concerned about how these rules were interpreted. And so that's how I sort of learned about the area and got involved. But I didn't have any practical connection until I heard about your case. Practical connection meaning real life, someone had been charged under this. And so when I heard about your case, I thought two things. One, what an incredible injustice. And second, that was a good magistrate who
Oh, yeah.
gave you a continuance and advised you to seek legal counsel because
And the DA was not happy at all.
no, the government's lawyer was not pleased at all, and so particularly when we filed our motion to have the case dismissed and to have this provision declared unconstitutional. As I've mentioned before, they really couldn't get out of the case.
They ran from it.
Yeah, and so we told the court not so fast. They felt comfortable enough hauling you into court and threatening you with potential jail time for simply filming on public lands. And I won't mention that.
That's one thing. Well, why didn't they haul him in? I mean, it's something we can't answer. But why was this man not put on the thing?
I think when they showed you the evidence that they knew you were on, Park's property, showing you, walking on Crybaby Bridge, they saw you doing, you on that property. I could have been filming from a far distance away, so they weren't sure. They didn't see me.
You're on Facebook.
That's possible.
But you're on Facebook by
I'm just saying that's
by the French cross.
Yeah,
a big Facebook picture of us all going like this. So they had that.
They had that too.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not aware of it, but I think that's what it is. They saw you on the property.
Right.
You're the main actor.
Anyway, Bob,
that's what I think would
continue.
What do you think? I need some good advice here.
I have no clue. I think probably, and the way I learned about it at the time was that they became aware of it because of the news coverage following the premiere of Crawford Road, and as a result, as you say, they knew where to find you. So
yeah,
they tracked you down, and that's a story we've heard repeated. And the people that we've talked to about this issue, that something or other will bring a bit of work to their attention, whether it's something posted on YouTube or something posted on their own website or whatever, that will either lead to a call or a visit from someone from the Park Service. And they have gone so far as to tell people to take images off their personal websites. And that we're aware of instances where people who simply would visit various national parks and take video from them because they posted on YouTube and had monetized that by getting a few dollars from advertising revenue.
Yeah, well, the one couple, I think she was in some of the paperwork, Carrie and Nate. And
they were fined like $2,500.
Wow.
And so this was something that affected a growing number of people, and more so since photography and filming has gotten so common because people can carry a film studio in their pocket with an iPhone. And
you can make a movie with a cell phone.
Yeah. Exactly. And so you have a lot of people who aren't aware that these rules exist, and from their standpoint, there's no reason for them to exist. And so more and more people were getting caught up in this. And so it was really important that courts and ultimately Congress address the issue.
My name is Ashley Cullens, and I'm an entertainment journalist and the former senior business editor for The Hollywood Reporter. Back when I was at Hollywood Reporter, I covered a lot of litigation, and that involved searching federal and state court dockets, basically for interesting cases that had implications for the entertainment industry. And when I came across Price versus Barr, I was shocked that no one was really covering it. Because not only was it interesting, you had an indie filmmaker going up against the federal government, but also there were serious First Amendment implications that were much bigger than this individual case. It's interesting because you look at this case and it's a small movie, and yet so many people in the entertainment industry got their start with small movies. So even though this wasn't the kind of thing that might normally catch Hollywood's attention, the underlying issues were so important that once I started writing about this, it became clear that everybody was a bit surprised that it wasn't being talked about all the time, because, the rules were deeply unfair to people who make film as art. And I remember at one point, the court ruled that films are protected by the First Amendment, but the act of filmmaking isn't, which is one of the most insane things I've heard in my entire life, because you can't get to the film without the filmmaking. The things that I thought was really interesting was the fact that the National Park Service was essentially arguing that a person recording for news, CNN, say, would have no problem in this situation. But because this was a filmmaker making a film for commercial purposes, that wasn't allowed. There was not really any reason why. And Bob Corn-Revere essentially boiled it down to being a tax on filmmaking, because a non-commercial production might not have the money to pay, whereas a commercial film would. So essentially, he was arguing that this was just a tax on filmmaking and that it served no real purpose in protecting the parks.
What I did learn in working on this case is that there are a wide range of photographers that are affected by these laws that require people to get permits or to pay a fee. And I should explain the background, by the way. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And there are two things in our history that are really pretty important rules that courts have applied in a range of different situations. One of them is you don't have to ask the government permission. You don't have to ask the government for a license to be able to speak. That's something that goes way back in the tradition of free speech. And so to require some sort of permit before you can engage in expressive activity like this cuts against the grain of our historical protections for freedom of speech. And the other is paying a fee. The government doesn't get to tax people, doesn't get to tax American citizens for the exercise of basic rights. And that's what this amounted to require the payment of a fee to engage in First Amendment protected activity is, again, something that is incompatible with our tradition of freedom in this country. Now, the government's justification was that this is commercial filming. This is something that is done for profit. But then all of our media, or most of our media, is conducted for profit. The New York Times isn't given away for free. Movies aren't given away for free. And yet, those activities are within the umbrella of the protections for freedom of speech and freedom of the press under the First Amendment. And so this was really no different. So after the first case was out of the way and Gordy was no longer in jeopardy for violating this law, we then filed a civil claim on his behalf in federal district court in Washington, D.C., seeking to have a declaration that the law violated the First Amendment. And lo and behold, the district court ultimately, on the briefs that we filed, declared that the law did violate the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free expression, and issued a nationwide injunction prohibiting the federal government from enforcing this law anywhere in the United States.
To me, the biggest issue here was that the problem was always about the content of the speech. It was because it was a commercial movie, it was being singled out. To a certain extent, I understand why the National Park Service wants to be cautious about who is working in the parks and what they're doing and how, because their primary job is to protect these parks, right? And so if you imagine a Marvel movie rolling in with hundreds of crew members and heavy equipment, then that could theoretically damage the natural environment. It could interfere with members of the public being able to use that space that day. But when you're talking about one person with a camera or a few people with cameras, there really isn't any argument for why that shouldn't be okay.
And that's one of the things that I learned in working on this case. Once we had a decision granting a nationwide injunction, we heard from photographers from all over the country that have various different ways of using these public resources as part of their expressive activity. There were wedding photographers who will often conduct weddings, or there'll be parts of weddings and take the photographs and video for weddings in national parks. You'll have people who arrange for wilderness adventures or guides and things like that. And in all of these cases, we are talking about not a huge Hollywood production where you're potentially disrupting a national park. You're talking about people who have the same impact on a park as most standard visitors. In Gordy's case, for example, you were talking about having just a party of 3 or 4 people there in the park conducting filming with unobtrusive equipment. That's not the kind of thing that justifies having some sort of permit and fee regime, and that's the point that we made in the district court, and one of the reasons why I think the court ruled in our favor at that point. But it's something that, from making that argument and getting that ruling, we learned just how widespread this issue is, and it affects people in a variety of different circumstances. It even affected people who just go to the park with their iPhone cameras and take video and post on YouTube, because on YouTube it gets monetized. There's advertising support. And so someone who visits the park in the same way as any other tourist, but then happens to post it and may make a few dollars from it, that was also considered to be a federal crime if done without paying the fee and getting a permit. And a lot of people were caught by that.
And in order to get people to change problematic laws, you need to bring attention to issues. And this case brought a lot of attention to the fact that filmmakers were being unfairly prevented from filming in parks in the same way that a news reporter or a member of the public would.
As you might expect, the federal government was not thrilled with the fact that the court had declared this law unconstitutional, and they appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And we briefed the matter, had oral argument, and a 3-judge Court of Appeals panel reversed the district court order and dissolved the injunction. It was a split decision where a panel of 2 of the judges agreed to reverse the district court, and the 3rd judge dissented and said that we had been right all along. The basis on which the court made that decision was one that we found really hard to understand, really hard to reconcile with the body of case law under the First Amendment that says that when you film something, you're engaging in putting together information, you're gathering speech, and that is protected under the First Amendment. The majority of that panel said, well, no, gathering information in that way is not something protected by the First Amendment. So we decided at the time that this was a matter ripe for Supreme Court review, and we filed what is called a petition for certiorari, which is a request for the Supreme Court to weigh in on a given matter. It usually happens when you have differences of opinion between different courts of appeals. You have what is called a circuit split, and it calls upon the Supreme Court to resolve that. And while we had a split among the circuits on how to treat photography under the First Amendment, there wasn't necessarily a circuit split on this specific law. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court doesn't explain the reasons it takes a case or doesn't take a case, and it declined to accept review in Gordy's case.
This is what you need to do to petition the Supreme Court. How much did this cost?
And how much do we owe you, right?
Yeah, how much do I owe you? About $8 million.
Yeah, I mean, the filing a petition for certiorari at the Supreme Court does require a lot of work. It's reflected here in this, what is called a cert petition. And you also have to go to a printer, have it professionally printed. And so there's quite a bit of expense involved. And the chances of having the court take your case are very low, less than 1 in 10. And so, you have no guarantees, but you take your shot. And we thought we had a good chance of getting the court to review this because of the difference that different circuit courts around the country have approached the question of whether or not photography is fully protected by the First Amendment. What we didn't have was a difference of opinion on this particular law between the different circuit courts. And I think that may have been what tipped the balance, but you never know why the court chooses to take a case or not to take a case. You just, as I say, you write your petition and you take your chances.
General consensus was, well, of course, this makes sense. And then to have that later reversed for a reason that didn't make any sense, it was a shame. And I don't think anybody who was paying attention to this would have expected that or thought that that would be the final outcome. This did seem like the exact kind of thing that the Supreme Court would take up. And so when they didn't, I think it was a bit disappointing.
Gordy, you've experienced some pushback from the other side of what's been accomplished.
Yeah, Crawford Road's Fossum just picked it up and it's on YouTube now. In fact, you can watch it free. Anyway, so I was doing some promotion and I put it on Reddit. So I started going on some of the nature blogs and talking about, what do you think about Price versus Barr? And I got some negative feedback by people. We don't want a bunch of big Hollywood people coming out and ruining our land. And one guy said that those laws are here for a reason, and you broke that law, and you deserve what you get. And, and we don't want a bunch of filmmakers coming out and shooting on our, parkland like it's, the guy lives next to it and it's his or something.
Well, and that's a common misconception that we saw repeated again and again. And, the reason why the law was passed in the first place was because commercial filming meant at the time it was passed, having big Hollywood productions come out with all kinds of equipment and crew and sound trucks and different things like that. And that makes sense if you're going to have people having that big a footprint on public lands, that there's got to be some way to control it and prevent it from damaging the environment and the park experience for visitors and so on. But that wasn't how this law was applied in cases like yours and countless other cases. And so one of the things that we accomplished in the court order that we got in your case was having an exemption for low impact filming, where you're not really talking about the impact on the land. You're really talking about just affecting individuals in small groups. And a lot of people fall into that category. And it's interesting, in the follow-up litigation that Colin and I did, we were representing two documentary filmmakers and had filed this case last December to challenge the law that still was on the books. And I spoke to a reporter out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The case was basically happening. And he started out being very skeptical of our position for the very reason that you just mentioned, saying, we want to protect the parks and all of that. And I explained to him that the documentarians that we represented were very conscious of that. And they were very much in favor, big environmentalists, very much in favor. You can see them pictured on the magazine right in front of you, Gordy. Very much in favor of protecting the land and preserving the resources. And we're very respectful of all of that. And I explained to him that the way this law works, you could have three people standing next to each other using identical equipment. One being a documentarian, another one being a news reporter, and the third a tourist, all using the same equipment, taking the same image. And only one of them would be required to get a
Permit.
a permit and pay a fee, and that would be the documentarian, because tourists aren't covered by it if it's non-commercial, and yet their impact on the land is the same. Reporters are exempt under the rules, but only the documentarian, only because of the arbitrary way in which these rules apply, and that's wrong.
Oh yeah, baby.
I'm Connor Burkesmith. I'm a photographer and videographer, mostly like in the realm of outdoor sports, action, stuff like that. I do a lot of shooting for outdoor brands as well as athletes.
I'm Alex Rienzie. I'm a filmmaker here in the Tetons, but I'm also a lawyer and investor by training. And Connor and I are partnering on a film called Racing Grand Teton about speed records, primarily on the Grand, but more generally in the Tetons. The star of our most recent drama is Michelino Sanseri, a local Teton athlete.
I think it was 2021, which was right at the start of my career, 2021. And I think that's when I actually called Alex, like freaking out a little bit. And that was because, you know, again, that was the whole drone thing. I applied just to fly a drone in an area where you're allowed to if it's not commercial. However, if it's commercial, you need a permit. And that was when they basically just went back through all the media I'd ever released on Instagram, YouTube, and just tried to find, you know, an example of me violating. And they never got back to me on the permit. They only got back to me to issue a citation. It was really bizarre.
In summer of 2024, we got an opportunity to go up there with Michelino Sanseri.
Yeah. So in 2024, I then went ahead and applied for a permit 30 days in advance, as we were supposed to. They got back to me initially saying that, hey, we're actually pretty busy right now. We've got a lot of permit requests, so we're going to require actually 60 days notice. That's the soonest you could do anything, which in 60 days, the Grand is covered in ice and snow. Then they got back again and said, under no circumstances would we ever give you a permit to film this, because by filming it somehow turns it into a competitive event. And, you know, maybe we can get you a permit to film in October, some B-roll, but you're not allowed to go to the summit, and, you know, you can basically poke around in the snow. So it was absolutely useless for us. And so, you know, we just made the decision to go ahead and film anyway. And at that point, Alex and I had both been in touch with Fire and thought that that there was basically, you know, First Amendment infringement going on. And we were like, let's do it. Let's film anyway. And, you know, if we have to deal with consequences, then so be it.
Last year, Fire filed a lawsuit in federal court in Wyoming representing two documentary filmmakers, Alex Rienzie and Connor Burkesmith. Alex and Connor were members of the National Press Photographers Association. We also represented that organization. What we were doing in that lawsuit is challenging a set of laws and regulations that require anybody filming in national parks who is filming with the intent to later make a profit to apply for a permit and pay a fee before they film in national parks. You know, Alex and Connor were good plaintiffs to challenge these laws because they had something very concrete they were trying to do. They had this footage, they wanted to make it into a film. They had tried to comply with these laws, they just couldn't get the permit. And these laws and regulations were actively preventing them from engaging in First Amendment protected speech, creating the documentary film that they wanted to make. That was what was violating their First Amendment rights. It was preventing them from creating this film because of the threat of prosecution hanging over them.
But as a result of the publicity, the National Park Service started threatening us with criminal charges through quotes provided to local newspapers. I mean, one of the challenges here is for Connor as a small operation, I mean, federal criminal charges are no joke. Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, if you're Uber and you got, 20 million in VC funding from your latest round, you got the money to hire good attorneys to fight back against city councils where they're being unreasonable. In his case, he kind of lucked out that I am a lawyer, and I dug into this issue and I figured you probably had a First Amendment violation. I was able to find the NPPA and fire to push back. But without any of that stuff, if you just push forward, you're up against a misdemeanor in the local federal court with long-term consequences permanently on your record. We've seen them go after friends with multi-year bans from national parks, which in Connor's case would more or less put him out of business. So it's tough being a small guy versus being a big venture-funded startup that has a legal team at their disposal.
Yeah, and definitely like all of that would just be placed straight on me. No one else is taking the citation. I don't think I can really evade any of those consequences. But we certainly did go a little bit renegade, I suppose, once we actually had a good, once we were talking to fire, we were with the NPPA and we said, screw it, we're filming anyway, we're going to do this thing. But that was more calculated, and I think Alex said it exactly right. For me to risk my entire business and or well-being getting, multiple federal misdemeanors just to do my work just seemed a little crazy. So, I would say at every point I tried my best to work with the national parks, the National Forest Service, and get permits when I could. But it was largely just a mess until really this summer when we did push back and said, screw it, we're filming. We think this is in our rights to do. Let's do it.
We knew what they were doing. We knew the National Park Service permitting regime was unconstitutional. Despite what the DC Circuit happened to think, the 10th Circuit would not have gone with that same reasoning, which was capturing video is in First Amendment protected speech. Almost every other circuit court disagrees with that. We felt we were well within our rights to go ahead and film anyway and let the legal challenge come.
We filed the case toward the end of the year in 2024, and just within days of having filed our case, Congress amended the law in a subsection of the Wilderness Act called the Film Act that repealed those provisions and essentially put into place the terms of the injunction that we had won in Price versus Barr.
When the National Park Service announced the passage of the Explore Act, in its guide for explaining what this does, it specifically calls out that all filming, still photography, audio recording is treated the same under this law. It doesn't matter if it's commercial, non-commercial, YouTubers, a news outlet, a student, or a member of the public. It's based on how many people you're going to have, the kind of equipment you're going to use, whether you're going to be in anyone's way who's out just trying to enjoy the park, instead of being based on what your project is about. That was always the problem here. And so the fact that this all resulted in common sense rules instead of a rule that implicates the freedom of speech, I think could inspire other kinds of examinations when it comes to the things you can and can't do while creating your art or any other kind of speech.
Some might argue that changing a law like this isn't all that significant because, after all, how many people in the country are, quote, commercial filmmakers or commercial photographers? But I look at this from a different perspective as a First Amendment lawyer, and that is, if the government violates any individual's rights, that's a problem. That's unconstitutional, and you need to find a way to vindicate those rights. So even if the population that is affected by this is relatively small in absolute terms, any violation of their First Amendment rights is a significant matter that needs to be remedied. And whether you're talking about people who are doing photography on public lands or giving a speech or having a demonstration, that the First Amendment still applies and still requires the government to adhere to those fundamental principles and those rights. We were pleased with what Congress did in changing the law. As I mentioned before, it was really, in the end, very similar to the what were called interim guidelines that were adopted after we won the decision in Price versus Barr, basically saying that low-impact filming does not require getting a permit. And that distinguishes it from, as I said before, a Hollywood production. If it comes in and you've got trucks and equipment, obviously that's the sort of thing where you'd want to require a permit. But where you have just a few people coming in and using cameras, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, then it doesn't serve any purpose to protect park resources to require a permit or charge a fee for that. And so what Congress did in changing the law was to fully appreciate that that difference exists, and we were satisfied with that.
Well, anyway, in the end, I guess we won.
Yes,
in a weird way, but it was a good ride.
Great job.
And I want to thank y'all. Changed my life.
What a ride. What a ride.
7 years. And now you
Got me scared to death.
you can watch Crawford Road on Fossil.
On Fossil.
And I won't get arrested.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Anything else?
Pleasure.
Good.
I think we're good. I mean, now that the Explore Act, now that you don't have that threat of prosecution hanging over you, any big projects that you've been working on?
We're filming another movie right now called The Lost Causer, and we're kind of weekend warrior guys, so we take our time. But
well, this movie actually takes place in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally. Some actual footage from the rally, and this movie stars Gordy as well. I play his parole officer, and this is so we're having a lot of fun, and you guys really made it possible. So when we do decide to go on National Park Service property, we know exactly how to present ourselves. And
Terrific.
Thank you. Okay.
Yep. We'll go down to the mall here and do some shooting.
All right. Great.
Okay.
Couldn't have done it a year ago. Would have been illegal.
Watch it. See, there you go, Gordy. There you go. Cool deal.
All right, yeah.
Get out of here. And I'll send you some.
Oh, it wasn't recording. I'm sorry, guys.
Woke up with my heart in a twist so tight, chasing shadows in the morning light, lonely roads and a heavy sky. Wondered if I'd ever know the why, but prayers were sent into the breeze, carried by the whispers of the trees. The weight it lifted like falling leaves. Turns out the answer was just to believe. The banjo sings a melody of yesterday.